There comes a moment in life when the noise fades, the crowd disappears, and the applause you've been waiting for never comes. That moment breaks most people. But for a few, it builds something unstoppable. Because the truth is, nobody is coming to validate your dreams. Nobody is standing by ready to clap for your effort. Nobody owes you recognition. And that's exactly where your power begins. Walk alone until they notice. Not because you're lonely, but because you're focused. Not because you've been rejected, but because you've chosen growth over comfort. Not because they ignored you, but because you refuse to stop. While they wait for approval, you move. While they seek attention, you build. While they hesitate, you execute. And one day, without warning, the same people who didn't see you won't be able to ignore you. No one owes you attention, and that realization hits a man at the exact moment he stops performing for approval and starts building for purpose. Many men are conditioned to seek validation through status, through noise, through constant visibility, but real growth begins in the silence where no one is watching. From a man's perspective, this silence can feel like rejection, like invisibility, like being overlooked despite effort. But from a woman's perspective, attention isn't given to potential. It's drawn to presence, to consistency, to quiet confidence that doesn't demand to be seen. When a man learns to move without needing recognition, he shifts from chasing attention to embodying value. Silence becomes the arena where identity is forged and discipline is tested without applause. Most men talk about what they will become, but few are willing to disappear long enough to actually become it. Women don't respond to noise as much as they respond to direction, subtle, grounded, and undeniable. When a man earns his attention in silence, he builds something deeper than attraction. He builds respect that doesn't rely on words. The man who walks alone isn't ignored. He's preparing, refining, and separating himself from those who need to be seen to feel worthy. Isolation isn't weakness. It's the environment where a man confronts who he is without distraction. Most men are taught to associate solitude with failure, as if being alone means being left behind. But in reality, isolation removes the noise that hides insecurity. From a man's perspective, this phase can feel uncomfortable, even threatening, because it strips away external validation and forces him to face his habits, discipline, and direction. Yet, from a woman's perspective, a man who has learned to stand alone carries a different energy. He isn't dependent. He isn't seeking constant reassurance. And he doesn't lose himself trying to be accepted. Isolation becomes less about being cut off and more about being carved into something stronger. Pressure is what turns isolation into a training ground, where identity is sharpened and emotional control is built. Many men escape this phase by surrounding themselves with distractions, but those who stay in it develop clarity that cannot be faked. Women don't just notice effort, they sense stability, the kind that comes from a man who has already faced himself and didn't flinch. When a man uses isolation to grow instead of hide, he builds resilience, focus, and self-respect without needing an audience. Stop performing, because the moment a man starts acting for approval, he loses connection with who he's supposed to become. Many men grow up believing they must impress, be louder, be funnier, be more visible, to be valued. But performance creates a fragile identity built on reactions rather than reality. From a man's perspective, this constant need to prove himself becomes exhausting because every room demands a different version of him. From a woman's perspective, performance is easy to notice. It feels forced, inconsistent, and often insecure. What draws real attention isn't the act, it's the authenticity behind it. The man who doesn't shift just to be accepted. Becoming begins where performance ends, in the quiet commitment to growth that no one applauds. When a man focuses on building himself instead of displaying himself, he develops depth that can't be replicated by surface-level charm. Women don't just respond to what a man shows. They respond to what he consistently is, even when no one is watching. The man who stops performing creates alignment between his actions and identity, and that alignment builds a presence that doesn't need validation to be felt. Consistency speaks louder than recognition. Because what a man repeats daily defines him far more than what others occasionally praise. Many men are driven by moments of validation, compliments, attention, acknowledgement, but those moments are temporary and unreliable. From a man's perspective, it's easy to confuse recognition with progress, to believe that being noticed means you're moving forward. But from a woman's perspective, recognition isn't nearly as powerful as reliability. What stands out isn't a man who shines once, but a man who shows up the same way over and over again, regardless of who is watching. Consistency signals control, discipline, and direction without needing to be announced. Repetition builds identity in a way attention never can, because it creates patterns that others begin to trust. Most men start strong and fade when results don't come quickly. But the ones who continue without applause develop a presence that feels grounded and unshakable. Women are drawn not just to effort, but to stability. The quiet assurance that a man's behavior isn't dent on mood or external reward. When consistency replaces the need for recognition, a man shifts from seeking approval to embodying it. And his actions begin to speak in ways words never could. Build so loud that your results speak before you ever have to. Because a man's true signal is not in what he says, but in what he consistently produces. Many men fall into the habit of announcing their plans, explaining their ambitions, and seeking early validation, but words create expectations while actions create proof. From a man's perspective, talking feels like progress. It gives the illusion of movement without the discomfort of execution. From a woman's perspective, however, words without results quickly lose weight because attention is drawn to what is real, not what is promised. When a man focuses on building instead of broadcasting, he replaces noise with substance. Silence becomes powerful when it is backed by visible growth that cannot be ignored. Most men underestimate how much presence is built through consistent, quiet effort, the kind that compounds over time and reveals itself without explanation. Women don't need a man to declare his value. They observe patterns, discipline, and direction, and they respond to what is demonstrated rather than described. The man who builds in silence develops a different kind of confidence, one that doesn't seek permission or reassurance because it is rooted in proof. Results create a language of their own that both men and women understand without translation. When a man's work ethic, discipline, and progress become undeniable, he no longer needs to convince anyone of who he is. His life begins to communicate for him. Shaping perception through action rather than intention. When they finally notice, it's no longer about them, it's about who you became in the process of walking alone. Most men start their journey wanting to be seen and wanting recognition to validate their effort, but somewhere along the path, something shifts. From a man's perspective, the early phase feels like being overlooked, like working in the dark while others get the spotlight. But that darkness forces growth that visibility never could. From a woman's perspective, attention isn't just triggered by effort. It's drawn to transformation, to the man who didn't just talk about change, but lived through it. By the time he's noticed, the need for that attention has already faded. Growth changes a man's relationship with validation in ways that are often invisible from the outside. The same man who once sought approval begins to value progress over praise because he understands that recognition is delayed, but development is constant. Women tend to observe this shift more than men realize. They notice when a man is no longer trying to prove himself, when his actions are no longer driven by external reactions. This creates a different kind of attraction, one rooted not in effort to impress, but in a grounded sense of self that doesn't fluctuate based on attention. Winning in this context is not about being seen. It's about becoming someone who no longer depends on being seen. Many men believe the victory is in the moment. Others acknowledge them. But the real victory happened much earlier in the discipline, the solitude, and the consistency no one clapped for. By the time recognition arrives, it feels secondary, almost irrelevant, because the man has already built an identity that stands on its own, independent of opinions, attention, or approval.